Hi, and welcome back to Bonding with a Book, Chapter Book Edition, the Unicorn Rescue Society, Chapter 14. Well, we didn't get a lot of action in Chapter 13, but we sure got started on some really interesting information. But before we get into all of that, you know how we start every single class. We start each class with a joke. Here's today's joke of the day.
What is the best time to go to the dentist?
Well, what is the best time to go to the dentist?
Tooth 30.
Tooth 30. This, I think, is my favorite joke. Thank you, Carson, for that joke. Oh my gosh, Carson, that has to be my favorite joke so far. 230. Kids, if you want to share a joke with me, have your parents email me and I will try to include your joke of the day in our daily joke of the day. That was a really great one, Carson. Thanks for sharing. Now, let's get into our chapter 13 recap. Chapter 13 was not very adventurous, but it had a lot of information. I think I'd like to call chapter 13 Mellow Tea. Melody and tea, blend it all together. Let's break that down. Chapter 13, which if we're sharing the same text, goes from page 62 to 66. So when we're looking for our evidence, those are the pages that we'll be looking at. We are talking about two really important things, melodies and tea. That's all that's really happening in chapter 13. First, let's talk about that tea. It's called sassafras tea. I looked it up. It's a real thing. And they have recipes online. I haven't tried it. If you try it, let me know how it tastes. But everyone in the class was giving this nice jar of sassafras tea. Who is the only one that was willing to drink it? You know what I'm going to ask you to do? To go look in your book for some answers. So, what page should I turn to? Is it on? Yes, on page 64. If we start at the paragraph, if we're all sharing the same text, that says except. Except I won't be hiking around with you, Dr. Thomas said, because I'm too darn old. She raised her jar, bottoms up. Professor Falna tipped his jar back and drained the sassafras tea. So he drank it. Professor Falna drank it. Is he the only one? Let's keep looking. Miss Vole snipped hers, smiled, and put it behind her. Elliot quickly did the same, and most of the other children. But Uchenna, our brave, daring female soul, she is girl and hear her roar, drank down the whole thing, right? And Elliot asked her, how was it? And she says, weird, like flat root beer. And then she asked, I'd kind of like it. Can I have yours? Well, there you go. Professor found it. He drank it. Something tells me it wasn't his first time. Dr. Thomas drank hers. Wasn't her first time either. But Uchenna, she says, hey, why not? Bottoms up, like a flat root beer. I'd like yours, please. Right? It's very cool. And then Dr. Thomas starts giving us the history of the melodies that she is and the people that lived on the land that is now the Pine Barrens. And where does all of this awesome history, which most of it is true, takes place in this book? Where do I look? Ready? At the very bottom of page 65, right? Dr. Thomas nodded. And if we start there, and I'm not going to read it all because we read it last week if you missed it, or last time if you missed it, Just go check the video out. She goes through and she tells us about an Indian tribe, an Irish group, a Jewish family, uh, all of these things that mixed up, and she became a melody. And then we find out more about who? Uchenna again. Then we find out that Uchenna is also a melody. She is mixed with a parent from New Orleans and a parent from Lagos, Nigeria. So therefore, she's this awesome melody. And they end the chapter with this whole little chuckle because Dr. Thomas says, we could be sisters. And Uchenna says, what? You're too old to be my sister. And then says, sorry. Uchenna's pretty funny. And that's where we left at the end of chapter 13. No action. We find out that Dr. Thomas is a melody. We find out Uchenna is a melody. We learn about a little sassafras tea. We see Uchenna's a little more daring and everyone else is not. And that's where they leave us going into chapter 14. And I'm ready to dig in, but before we do, or before we read questions. Before we read, it's important that we frame our thinking for the upcoming chapter.
What is your favorite family story about history?
My favorite family story that has to do with American history is told by my granny. She was a little kid towards the end of the Great Depression, and I asked her, what was it like? And she said, in the way she describes it, it doesn't sound like it was that awful. I'm sure it was really bad, but she said everybody shared, and that's what I really love about the story. If there was one bike on the block, all the kids on the block shared the bike. They'd take turns. Whenever the bike was out there, whoever wanted to ride it would ride it, and when they were done, they would leave it there, and the whole neighborhood shared it. How all the men would go out together and fish and bring it back and divide it equally among the families that were there, and how all the women pooled their resources to make sure all the children and the families had everything that they needed to get through the very difficult times. And that story just lets me and reminds me always that together we are better. And so that is my favorite family story from history. What's yours?
And now it's time to read. I invite you to cozy up with your book, lend me your ear, as we settle into Chapter 13 of the Unicorn Rescue Society.
Chapter 14. The light from the kerosene lamp flickered over the faces of the people in the cabin. Elliot tried to fight off the spider that was now determined to crawl in the gaps between the floorboards he was sitting on without actually touching the spider. Those mason jars you're drinking from, well, some of you are drinking from, Dr. Thomas said, eyeing Miss Vole. The first one of those in history was made right here in the Pine Barrens. The old woman leaned in her head and smiled. Yes. The Pine Barrens are a strange and wondrous place. Aren't many places like this in the world? The children settled in more comfortable positions. It looked like Dr. Thomas was winding up to tell a story. She sounded like she knew how to tell a story, too. Children can always tell. For a long time, the Pine Barrens has been a place for melodies like me, for people who didn't quite fit in. The Lenni Lempe tribe was here first, of course. Many were forced off their lands by colonists, but some remained. They still here, keeping traditions going, keeping traditions strong. Then, in the time of the American Revolution, there were people called Tories who wanted Okay, let's try that again. For a long time, the Pine Barrens has been a place for melodies like me, and for people who don't quite fit in. The Lenni Lempe tribe was here first, of course. Many were forced off their lands by colonists, but some remained. They're still here, keeping tradition strong. Then, in the time of the American Revolution, there were people called Tories who wanted America to be loyal to the King of England and stay an English colony. They weren't real popular during the Revolution, so they came to hide here in the pines. Around the same time, there came the Quakers. Quakers don't believe in fighting ever, no matter what. I don't blame them. But some Quakers believed so much in the Revolution and in America being free, they went and fought the British anyway. Well, after the war, they weren't welcome at home since they had fought, so they came to live here too. Now, can you imagine that? Now, can you imagine that? Quakers who wanted to fight for independence so much that they had to leave their homes, and Tories who loved the king so much they had to leave too, and both of them living side by side. Then there was the Underground Railroad. When slaves came north, escaping their chains, they were used to saying, "When you get to Jersey, don't stop until the pines are no taller than a man. Any closer to Philadelphia and you are liable to get snatched by a slave hunter. You saw the little pine trees outside my house." The children nodded silently. Well, my great-grandfather got to those pygmy pines and he stopped and built this home. Out here, black people could live free. There are whole towns not too far from this house, started by slaves who fought their way to freedom. So you had American Indians and Tories and Quakers and escaped slaves and pirates too. Professor Fowler told you about those pirates, didn't he? He would have. He does love talking about those pirates. You had all those people living here together in these pines. Now, what does that sound like to you? "It sounds like a mess," Miss Vole said. Dr. Thomas slapped her knee. You're darn right. You're darn right. It was a mess. And it was more than that. It was melting pot, if you know what I mean. Professor Fowler leaned forward and stroked his beard. Dr. Thomas pointed a papery finger at the children. You had all these rich men, Washington and Jefferson, all running up and down the East Coast saying they were fighting for a place where people could live free. But those Tories couldn't live free. Lenny Lepe couldn't live free. Those slaves surely couldn't. Dr. Thomas sighed. The woods for Thomas Jefferson's desk, which he wrote the Declaration for Independence on, came from the Pine Barrens. Did you all know that? The children shook their heads. Of course you didn't. The founding fathers thought they were inventing America. But we were the ones inventing America. You know what America looks like? It looks like me. Dr. Thomas tapped her chest with her bony hand. Look right here, children. It looks like me.
Looks like her. Wow. This chapter had a whole lot of history in it. And that kind of brings me to your end of the chapter question. Here's today's end of the chapter question.
What does it mean to be an American?
Well, what do you think? In this story, if you're joining me from anywhere outside of America, because that's where I'm at, this whole chapter is talking about basically what does it mean to be an American, right? And that's a question we ask ourselves to this day. Does an American look a certain way? Do they eat a certain food? Do they believe a certain thing? And Dr. Thomas is saying that she is what it means to be an American. America looks like her. And I wonder, what do you think America looks like? Or if you're in Canada, what do you think it means to be a Canadian? What does Canada look like? Or if you're Parisian, wherever you are, what does it mean to be a part of that nation, that culture, that community? And what does it look like? Because we often ask that question or say something has to look a certain way. Is there a specific look to being an American, a Canadian, a Parisian? What does it mean? So I'd really like to know what you think it means to be where you're from and what does that look like? And it brings me to my favorite time where I get to be Oprah for like 30 seconds. You ready? Ready? It's prediction time! I want to know what your predictions are for chapter 15. Are we going to finally get some action? Is it going to be more history inside of the cabin? The creepy, creepy cabin? Are we going to leave the cabin and go explore some more? Is the creature coming back? Am I ever going to see a unicorn? What happens in chapter 15? But we have to wait until next time. I know I always hate leaving us on these little cliffhangers, but I am always so appreciative that we got to spend this time together. Thank you so much for bonding with this book with me. The Unicorn Rescue Society, we're on chapter 14. I will see you next time. Bye.